welcome to the second of the program presentations on the Quanah Parker, Cynthia and Parker exhibit. Some of you were here last time, but for those of you who weren't, the exhibit really goes back at least 3 years, and Clara Riddell and Bob Holmes and myself, we were the ones that came up with the idea of having an exhibit on Quanah and Cynthia and Parker. And the Lakes Trail and their banner over here, we convinced them that they should take on the responsibility for making this a traveling exhibit. And the original exhibit is the one in black and white on the far wall. And it has gone to about 16, 17 different places, and so we have been delighted with that. Now, not being museum specialists, we've come close to cutting our wrists on a number of occasions as we made all kinds of faux pas in terms of how do you hang the stuff, how do you mail it, and all of that. So any of you that are really in that world, I admire the knowledge that you have in terms of being able to know all of those things. We've learned some of them. Also, we have a number of sponsors who have been helpful. This is, I think, it's from a financial standpoint, this has been a very modest sort of effort, but we did get help from the Mayor's Promotional Fund, the Worthington Hotel, the Redstone Visual Impressions. Really, we owe them a deep debt of gratitude because they're the ones that, in fact, created kind of the first images that you see on the wall and have worked with us to perfect, in fact, how you hang those images and how you size them and all the other kind of practical kinds of things. Convention Visitor Bureau has been helpful. Texas Historical Commission, in fact, on the wall over here, the west wall, is predominantly from their brochure on say the Buffalo Wars, the Red River War, whatever you want to call it, and the speaker or the author who in fact wrote that, did the research, and the book on all of that's going to be one of our speakers, and he is on the program. Of course, the library. Where did Julia go? Is she hiding? Anyway, when you see Julia, there she is. She's back here. The library has been fabulous in terms of providing this wonderful space, and in fact, I'm on a committee. We're kind of updating the downtown master plan. And one of the things we talked about today is how the library and the facilities we have here, we're so fortunate to have, are such a big part of the cultural life of the city and the entertainment. And I predict that it'll be even greater in the kind of the years ahead. Friends of the Fort Worth Library that run the bookstore and all of that, and the Comanche Nation, and Imagination Celebration. In fact, we just got the list of I don't know, 12, 13 groups of school children, about 100 each, that the three of us, and with some help from psychiatric people, we're going to be coordinating them through the library and the exhibits. It's going to be really wonderful, because I think the purpose of all of this, for some of us that are kind of on the tilting side of life, you could say, as the sun goes down and the whatever, we've got these young people coming along, and they're the ones we really want to educate and influence and help them be smarter than any of us have ever been. You've got some handouts up there. One of the things we discovered is there's a school powwow, and there's a flyer up there about that. It's on the 20th of October, and you can pick that up there, as well as there's a bibliography that I think kind of outlines a lot of the kinds of issues. In fact, today I'm delighted that with the focus of the presentation today, because this, I think, is one of the very important pieces of what is a very, very big puzzle, you could say, very, very big picture of issues relating to the relationship between the newcomers to the Americas, the Anglos, and the indigenous people that were here. And that whole history is so complicated and something we all need to learn so much more about. And the story, the issues, the problems, the challenges continue to go on. One of our other speakers, Lance Tomacari, he was here last time. I appreciate him being here. And I think his perspective, along with all of the others put together, provide much of that overall picture. Well, I'd like to introduce now the mother of this whole effort, Clara Rudell. Give her credit because it was her looking at all these photos that started all of this. She's going to introduce our speaker.
Well, I'll just step out here since the microphone's not working anyway, and it's my pleasure to introduce Debbie Liles. Debbie is a PhD candidate. She is teaching project manager for the Digital Austin Papers, the UNT Digital Scholarship Lab, and she works with the Texas Historical Association. It was my pleasure to meet Debbie when she popped in and out at Will Rogers. I was the manager out there for about 10 years and had met a lot of people who wanted to do research at Will Rogers. And of course, I've been around there for a very long time, and Debbie says she'd like a little skirt around the property, which we did, and all of a sudden she wants to know if she'd go up in the tower. So she says, well, we're going to go up in the tower. I got the tower open. I said, we're not going to go up in the tower. You're going to go up in the tower. So Debbie went all the way to the top. Bob went, I understand now, not all the way to the top. Well, Debbie could walk, but Bob couldn't walk for about 3 days, and I very smartly did none of it. But that's when I met Debbie, and it's been my pleasure to work with her and help her a tiny, tiny little bit, which I appreciate her mentioning me in her book. Her book is for sale out on the table at $22. If you haven't bought it, please do. If you want to know about Will Rogers, this is the book for you. So it's my pleasure to introduce my dear friend, Debbie Liles.
I would like to let you know that Kilroy was also at the top of the tower. He was written right there on the side. It said Kilroy was here. Thank you, Clara, for that nice introduction. I wasn't nervous, so you said all those nice things. A little bit about me and how I came to do this research. On the Indians in this portion of Texas, I actually study slavery and how it developed in the northwestern quadrant of Texas in the antebellum years. And most of the sources that you have to depend on for this study are secondary sources, which were basically written long after the Civil War, around the 1930s, when we started getting ready to celebrate the independence of Texas. And of course, during those times, a lot of the books tended to exaggerate the truth about how bad it had been with the Indians in the early days. And I started thinking, well, was it really that bad? Was there really that many problems? And if there had been that many problems, how come people came out here and settled like they did? And so I started looking, and instead of looking at the secondary sources that had been written during the 30s and the end of the 1900s, I started looking at, at the primary sources, the Indian papers, the reports that had actually been made by the Indian agents that were around during those first few years. So this is what I found. And I hope my slides go along with what I'm reading. If not, please let me know. So, uncontested ground, the northwestern frontier of Texas, 1846 to 1855. On May the 28th, 1870, a memorial to 350 people who had been killed on the northwestern frontier of Texas was entered into the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C. Contained in this proclamation is a declaration from the tax assessor and collector of Wise County, who stated that from 1860 to 1870, the voting population in Wise County had decreased from 800 to 350 persons due to depredations committed by Indians. Wise County was not the only county on the frontier to experience a lot of citizens during its early years. Loss of population in Parker and Palo Pinto counties was recorded during those same years. Frontier protection had always been a problem in Texas. For the Spanish, the threat had been the French. For the Mexicans, it had been the Americans. For the Americans, it had been the Indians. And for the Indians, it was all of the above. Until the 1850s, the northwestern quadrant of Texas had not been included in the contested ground between the Indians and the whites. As early settlement had occurred primarily in the eastern and southern parts of the state, this territory had been exempt from altercations born of the advancing frontier. But during the years between 1850 and 1860, Texas experienced its largest gain in population, from 212,000 to 604,000 residents. Out of all the areas in the state, the fastest growing region was this northwestern section, which was basically this area within this beautiful square. Texan authorities insisted that protection from the Indians was needed on the frontier in order for white settlement to occur during these early years. When Texas became the 28th state on December the 29th, 1845, it retained control of its public land, but protection of this land from the Indians became the responsibility of the United States. At that time, Anglo and Mexican settlement had only occurred in a relatively small portion of Texas. The rest of the land was being hunted, lived on, farmed, and claimed by different Indian groups. Governor James Pinckney Henderson insisted the frontier would recede and be reclaimed by Indians if the government did not provide current and future settlers with the protection needed. To avoid Henderson's prediction, Texas and the federal government pursued a policy of protection for the whites and detainment or extermination for the Indians. By doing this, they inadvertently condemned the northwestern frontier and doomed the growth of its southern way of life in its budding communities. This paper argues that from annexation, 1845, until the establishment of the reservations, which is 1855, there were very few problems between the Indians and the white settlers on northwestern Texas, which I define as from Parker County north to the Red River and west to the 100th parallel. Despite perpetuation of the contrary, before the reservations existed, Indian relationships with the settlers on the frontier were not filled with the brutality that defined the 1860s and 1870s that was mentioned at the opening of this paper. If anything, frontier life in the early years in this region was one that fixed the new historiographical definition as one that was shared by two cultures, not one that was constantly fought over. On the full moon of March 1846, United States Indian agents Pierce Butler and M.G. Lewis met with several hundred Texas Indians at Comanche Peak in present-day Hood County. This is obviously present-day Hood County because I don't think those houses were there at the time. The intended purpose of this meeting was for the Indians to acknowledge that the United States was their protector and that certain rules were to be adhered to if benefits were going to be received by them. No treaty was made because the Indians, including Comanche Chief Buffalo Hump, and you know it's Buffalo Hump because right there on his hat it says Hump. Do you see it? Okay. Buffalo Hump would not agree to it. Despite this, Butler and Lewis came away from the meeting with the arrogant concept that the Indians were impressed with the strength of the United States, that this impression was needed to show the Indians that frontiersmen would be protection, and that they were weak when compared to white forces. The follow-up meeting on May 15th produced the Treaty of Council Springs. Along with the aforementioned acknowledgement that the United States was the protector of the Indians, a proclamation was issued by Albert C. Horton, first Lieutenant Governor of Texas, on June the 1st, which stated that all citizens, including surveyors, must stay away from land that was above or bordering existing settlements in order to avoid confrontation between the whites and the Indians. He also penned a letter to John R. Bryan, William Conover, and Charles Durgan in Dallas to let them know that authorization had been granted to raise mounted volunteers to help them in the northern section of the state. Arrangements were made for a total of 7 companies of men to provide frontier protection. 5 of them went onto the southern frontier along the Rio Grande, as this is where the depredations were primarily occurring. 2 of them were dispatched to the western frontier to protect the stretch of land from the Red River to the Brazos. They were to be located by trading stations on the Trinity and the Brazos. Positions in the companies were filled quickly by frontiersmen at their own expense, who were led to understand that they would be mustered into service by the U.S. government almost immediately. Just 1 month later, Horton wrote to Secretary of War William Marcy and President James Polk, who had jointly decided to disband the companies. Horton questioned their decisions and stated he believed that without the protection of the frontier companies, the Indians would devastate white population on the frontier, and he once again pointed out that Texas was dependent on the federal government to provide this necessary protection. By mid-October, Horton again wrote to Polk to inform him that problems had begun on the frontier, as the Indians did not believe that the U.S. government would deliver presents as promised in the County of Trent Treaty of Council Springs, stating it was well worth the value of $1,000 worth of presents to keep the peace. Horton also pointed out that the Indians were not the only ones committing offenses, as white settlers on the frontier were breaking the Treaty of Council Springs by selling whiskey and other articles to the Indians. Added to that, spectators, surveyors, and settlers were also moving over the difficult-to-pinpoint borderline between the whites and the Indians. Horton predicted a collision was sure to be the end result. With his hands tied, as Indian management was the exclusive duty of the United States, the lieutenant governor had done all he could by informing the president of the state of affairs. The reason for lack of interest in Texas frontier protection at this time is simple to understand. The Mexican-American War had started April the 25th, 1846, when Mexican troops fired upon American troops in contested territory and given Polk the excuse he needed to pursue his expansionistic agenda. When compared to the stakes in that engagement, the protection of a few settlers on the frontier of Texas did not have a leg to stand on. And just to add insult to injury, Texas was asked to raise manpower to go and fight the cause. Texas Governor Henderson informed the president that Texas had raised as many as 4 companies of men, but they were loath to leave their homes for an undetermined period of time. Henderson also mentioned that his experienced officers were needed in the state to lead others protecting the frontier from the Indians. As Henderson and Horton feared, Texas did suffer from a lack of frontier protection, but it was the southern frontier that suffered, not the northwestern. Regiments of men in the south of Texas were called into Texas by General Zachary Taylor, and as a result, the stretch of land from Laredo to Corpus Christi, down here, was left to fend for itself. Henderson wanted to organize another regiment to be directed by Colonel John Coffee Hayes, but that was not to be, as Hayes was also called down to Monterey to report to Taylor. In 1848, a trail of letters addressed the continued push for frontier forces. The new governor of Texas, George T. Wood, repeatedly insisted that the United States provide requested protection because the northwestern frontier was, quote, in more danger of Indian molestation than any other portion of the state. Instead of an increase, Wood received word from Colonel Peter H. Bell that the War Department had discharged frontier troops. Evidence supports the colonel's decision, as other than a letter from General William Jenkins Worth, who reported that some Indian thefts had occurred on the east side of the Lower Cross Timbers, there was no evidence to support any problems on the northern frontier. In the meanwhile, the Mexican-American War ended with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe, Hidalgo on February 2, 1848. Aside from taking half of Mexico's territory, the U.S. agreed to an Indian task they could not complete. Among other things, Article 11 of the treaty stated that the United States was now responsible for stopping Indians in the United States from attacking settlements in Mexico. Texans recognized the difficulties that this posed and voted against the article. Sam Houston believed that it would cost the United States more money in Indian affairs than it would gain in territory, but the article passed anyway. Shortly thereafter, a line of federal forts was established to protect frontier Texans from Mexican and Indian invasions. The western fort line began 85 miles west of San Antonio at Fort Inge in Uvalde County and extended up to Fort Worth in Tarrant County. The biggest concentration of the western forts was in central Texas, where the highest population on the frontier was settled. The area north of Fort Worth and south of Fort Inge were shorted on the numbers of men to compensate the other regions. The most northern of these forts, Fort Worth, was established June 6, 1849. Commander Ripley Arnold, Company F of the 2nd Dragoons, picked a location that was later found to be unhealthy, and so a new one was chosen by August of 49. Composed of several rough-hewn log quarters for the men, a hospital, stable, commissary store, wheelwright shop, blacksmith shop, guardhouse, and quartermaster's storehouse, the fort was located in an area with plenty of grass for grazing. It was also in a location where contractors with hay, corn, and beef could come and sell their wares. Most of the supplies came from New Orleans after they had traveled up the Brazos and Trinity rivers. Others traveled on one of the 3 main roads into Fort Worth from Austin, Houston, and Shreveport. With the founding of Fort Worth, civilian settlement picked up to the west, and Indian trading posts like White Settlement were set up. In 1849, other events led to the settlement and exploration of northwest Texas. Gold had been discovered in California the year before, and many fortune seekers had been making their way across the continent to grab their share of the loot. Shortly before the better-known expedition of Randolph Marcy, several lesser-known people went through the region without experiencing any trouble at all with the Indians. Among these travelers was the Mitchler Expedition, a group of 22 topographical engineers working for the United States Army who were planning a new road from eastern Arkansas to El Paso. I couldn't figure out which one of those regions they were trying to get away from to get to, but anyway, from eastern Arkansas to El Paso. Enough other people passed through the region that resting stations at Buffalo Springs and Prairie Spring became the first commonly known areas in Clay County. Here travelers would rest and graze their stock. No Indian depredations were recorded by any of these white people during their journeys. Other travelers included a group of men going to California from Dallas. On their way, they passed through present-day Tarrant, Parker, Hood, Palo Pinto, Stevens, Shackelford, and Taylor counties towards their destination. In Hood County, 7 friendly Caddo Indians came to visit the party, and in Palo Pinto County, they camped close to where approximately 50 unnamed Indians had set up their tents. C.D. Gibbs recorded in his journey that the Indians were in dire need of food. The party went to the Quiche village located at the east bank of the Brazos among the Indians, but no trouble was experienced there. In fact, on the whole trip to the Rio Grande, no trouble with any of the Indians, nor any evidence of any prior trouble was recorded in Gibbs' journal. Marcy himself left the best known and most thorough descriptions of the region. Picked to accompany a party of California-bound gold hunters in Santa Fe, New Mexico, his task was to ascertain the best route for future travelers between there and Fort Smith, Arkansas. He stated that he encountered several hundred men, women, and children from the Comanche and Kickapoo tribes, that many of the Comanches shared letters of recommendations from Americans, and that they professed they were Americans, not Comanches. Despite the fact that many of the Kickapoo warriors were equipped with Derringer and Tyrone rifles, no trouble was reported. In spite of the relative calm on the northwestern part of the state, reports of serious depredations had been made to Congress about the conditions on the frontiers of Texas. In April 1850, it was reported that within the past year there had been, quote, 204 killed, wounded, or carried into captivity by the Indians, besides a great many more which cannot at this time be ascertained, close quote. A loss of $103,000 of property was also stated. At least 175 of the dead, 7 of the wounded, and 25 of the captives were taken from west of Corpus Christi in the summer of 1849. More were killed or taken during the months of December and January, with raids going in as far as Goliad. But no depredations occurred on the northwestern section. Using the information provided by the Mitchler and Marcy expeditions, and individuals such as Gibbs, it is highly doubtful that any problems occurred, as they surely would have mentioned it in one of their notes. Another issue spoke to the relative safety being experienced in northwestern Texas. The Clarksville Northern Standard, the state's second most popular newspaper, reported that 500 people had come across from the Arkansas River at Little Rock in November 1849 alone. Added to this, Federal Indian agent Robert S. Neighbors reported that there were no problems with the Indians of Texas, and it had been that way for 2 years, despite difficulties on being able to meet with the Kiowa, Apache, and the upper band of Comanche. He also stated that many of the different tribes were willing to settle down and become farmers, but they could not as the state denied them land, and what land they lived on now was disappearing due to white settlers. Yet Governor Bell continued to recommend that the Texas legislature form a frontier force to protect settlers. A petition from Limestone County residents requested Indians in their area to be moved above Fort Graham and Fort Worth because they said residents did not feel safe. The following month, Bell informed the U.S. Congress that security for the northern settlers of Texas was unsatisfactory, and he requested the federal government adopt a policy that would make Indians withdraw from the area or provide a line of forts and increase the number of mounted patrols to protect said settlers. This was followed up in May 1850, when Major General George M. Brooke, commander of the 8th Military District, wrote to Winfield Scott, commander of the Army. He informed him that the Indian raids were becoming a problem and, quote, "It is impossible to bring these deluded people into a sense of their weakness compared with the power of the United States, unless by severe chastisement, and which cannot be effected without carrying the war into their homes and fortresses, and for the same reasons that we are unable to comply with the 11th article of the treaty with Mexico, guaranteeing protection from Indian attacks and depredation." Brooke then went on to express an equal status with the Indians was unacceptable, and it would cause war between the Indians and the white settlements to continue forever. He recommended building new posts on the frontiers, attacking the Indians in their villages to exterminate them, or setting farmers and blacksmiths among them with added subsidiaries. Brooke believed that these were only solutions, as Indians could no longer sustain themselves if they were unable to roam the state and follow the mustangs and make a living. Bell concurred, but advised that if Indians were given their own land, that it must be far away from settlements of white citizens, as there was too much bad blood between them. By October 28, 1851, treaties had been signed with the Comanches, Caddo, Lipan, Quapaw, Tawakoni, Waco, Mescalero, and other tribes. Among the regular stipulations, there was one that stated that the Indians would not pass the eastern line of forts without permission, which are these forts right here. In return for this, the United States would supply teachers, blacksmiths, and preachers to live among the Indians. Before a month was out, the treaties had been broken and the Indians were punished with the strict consequences, which included the rule that mules and horses were not to be purchased from them, cutting off much of their income. As requested by Brooke and Bell, 2 additional forts were added to the frontier. Post Belknap was established by Lieutenant Colonel W.C. Belknap of the 5th Infantry on June the 24th, 1851. Located on the far edge of settlement, detachments of Company G and I from the 5th Infantry were stationed there to keep an eye on the Indians from the north and the west. The post became later known as Fort Belknap, where it was moved 2 miles north, November the 1st, later that year. Located 3/4 of a mile north of the Brazos River, it may have seemed like a good site, but the water was of poor quality and not always plentiful. Settlers followed the soldiers to Fort Belknap, and a village soon developed. Coal that was found in the area was used at the fort for heating and the blacksmith's forge. Settlers likewise used it for heating and for cooking. This coal, made nationally known, and the possibilities it offered when Marcy's notes were published in 1854, was indeed an asset in a region where timber was scarce, and over the next few years, miners removed several tons a year for heating and blacksmithing. Parker County soon had more people in it than most of the counties in this area. Located between Fort Worth and Fort Belknap and on the direct path from Fort Graham, it is easy to see how these people would feel protected. Settlers soon began to arrive not long after John Patrick and Port Smythe surveyed the land in 1851, and by 1854, 225 settlers signed the petition to form the county. During these years, no problems with the Indian were reported in Parker County. A second fort was soon located approximately 75 miles west of Fort Belknap in present-day Jones County. Fort Phantom Hill, more commonly known as the post on the Clear Fork of the Brazos, was established November the 14th, 1851. Set up more as a protection for travelers on the way to California than for frontier settlers, Phantom Hill was located on Marcy's Albuquerque Trail. While this location proved better for later endeavors, such as a stop on the Butterfield Southern Overland Mail Route in 1858, it was a terrible place for the fort. There was no usable timber within 6 miles and no healthy drinking water. The water was was brackish, and at one time there were buffalo carcasses decaying in the river. The only good water to be had was in a well 4 miles away, and it had to be hauled in. Because of no water, there was no vegetable garden. Because of no vegetables, the men got sick. The post doctor's solution for the resulting scurvy was for the soldiers to eat pickles, but this did not cure the dysentery and other bad water illnesses. During its 3.5-year occupation, 293 causes of illnesses and 2 deaths were reported in the 231 men who were stationed there. That doesn't sound like very good odds, does it? White men were not the only ones at the post, indicating that the danger was not imminent. Along with the Indians coming in and pitching their tents at the post, there was also at least one white woman and her young daughter who were residents and a slave who belonged to a Mr. T. N. Gibbons. The establishment of these frontier posts was responsible for bringing settlers to Shackleford County. The first recorded settler was United States Indian agent to the Comanches, Jesse Stem, who set up his home in October 1852. Despite the fact the Stem was located near Fort Phantom Hill, where agriculture was never successful, he cultivated enough corn and oats that he sold the access to Fort Belknap. Stem's story is one that needs to be included, not just because he was a successful settler, but because he was one of the few settlers that died due to Indian depredations during these years in question. Aside from the loss of Stem, 1852 was a year that was filled with exaggeration when it came to Indian atrocities. Many outrageous events were attributed to different tribes all over the state, but were at many times committed by white men, if they even happened. One rumor on the northwestern frontier was that a large group of soldiers on the Clear Fork of the Brazos had been killed. Panic ensued, and a meeting of residents of 6th County was held in McKinney, and another petition was submitted for more protection. Another example of the mindset of the time is revealed in the report of the post surgeon at Fort Phantom Hill for 1852. A paragraph describing some of the Indians in the area and the Tonkawa who were close to Fort Graham states, quote, "I have been told by a respectable Texan that they are cannibals, and their pregnant women have been known to cut the feet off dead bodies and eat them under the belief that children would thus become great walkers. Close quote. While all this was going on, surveyors for the Texas Immigration and Land Company were hard at work in and around Clay County throughout 1852 and 1853, and no problems with the Indians were recorded. The year 1853 saw several events that all had an impact on the northwestern frontier. This was the year of the Gadsden Purchase, the Comanche Treaty, when non-aggressive immigrant Indians were led out of Texas, and the year that the planning for 2 reservations in Texas actively began. The Gadsden Purchase signified the government's commitment to 2 things: the attempt to build a southern transcontinental railroad and an end to Article 11 in the Treaty of Guadalupe, Hidalgo. Despite the fact that the Southern Railroad did not materialize at this time, preliminary plans had suggested it would be built through northwestern Texas and across the 32nd parallel. This helped spur immigration to the region as more settlers saw the value of the railroad in their communities. The end of the obligations to Article 11 coincided with a decision to build new forts on the frontier as the frontier moved further west. An inspection by Lieutenant Whiting of the Army led to the frontier line being relocated west by 1954. This placed 2,000 soldiers in the midst of the Indians to hopefully discourage the formation of raiding parties by impressing them with the strength and resources of the United States. There would also be moving cavalry camps, which would be continually in motion and would help men stationed at the forts to keep the Indians away from the white populations or exterminating them as needed. Forts Ing, Lincoln, Martin Scott, Austin, Grogan, Gates, Graham, and Worth were all but abandoned, and a new line of forts now went from Fort Davis, 446 miles west of San Antonio, to Fort Belknap in Young County. By 1853, the U.S. signed a treaty with the Comanches. Their strength was deteriorating due to white encroachment, loss of land and food, and a severe outbreak of cholera. While the U.S. was working on the Comanches, Texan authorities chose to remove groups of friendly Indians from the state. In early June 1853, a group of Delaware, Shawnees, and Quapaws were led through Fort Worth on their way to Indian Territory. The Delawares and Shawnees had acted as guides and translators at many councils and expeditions to the frontier, as they spoke English and Comanche and other Indian languages, but this was not enough to hold them in good stead. The reason for their removal was not that they had caused trouble, but the perceived troubles from the previous years caused settlers to demand the state and federal authorities do something to protect them. As a result, a resolution was passed that required all immigrant Indians, the Delaware, Shawnee, Quapaw, Seminoles, to be removed from Texas and sent to Indian Territory. They met on the Llano River and went by Fort Graham, Fort Worth, up to Colonel James Borland's trading post in Cook County and across the Red River. This project was unpopular with those who knew the Indians more than most. Robert Neighbors thought the whole thing ridiculous, and Henry Barnard of Barnard's Trading Post in southern Johnson County, who believed that the most faithful, honest, and loyal of the Indians were being taken from Texas. Agents estimated that there were 351 of these Indians in the group, but Barnard stated there were probably no more than 60. The U.S. paid the agents $25,000 to remove the Indians. To end this chapter, in less than a year, the Delawares were brought back to Texas, only to end up on reservations. The largest impact the region would experience in 1853 was the decision to locate 2 Indian reservations in its midst. Am I behind? I must be behind. I'm sorry. The largest impact the region would experience in 1853 was the decision to locate 2 Indian reservations in its midst. In September, Secretary of War William Jefferson Davis wrote to Governor Bell and suggested that Texas follow the example of the U.S. and designate land for the confinement of the Indians and turn it over to the U.S. to manage. If this was done, quote, their presence everywhere would be an offense, at once justifying interposition of the military force. This policy, he stated, has been pursued with perfect success by the government of the United States. The bill was passed February 6, 1854, and the Indian Department prepared to relocate and confine over 1,000 Indians to a space of 12 leagues of land. Here they would teach the savages to farm, raise stock, and become self-sufficient. Agent Neighbors and Captain Marcy were put in charge of locating the land for the reservations. The combination of a man who understood and was trusted and respected by both Indians and officials in Washington, and a man who was perhaps as familiar with the territory as the Indians themselves, made for the best possible team to select the land. They conducted the search from July the 15th to August the 1854, in the general area of the northwestern counties of Knox, Baylor, Archer, Wichita, Haskell, Throckmorton, and Young. Crucial components of acceptable locations were availability of fresh water and arable land. During the search, Marcy recorded details such as an availability of timber, wildlife, and waters. It's real hard to see where they went. Do you see that purple line that kind of goes around? Let me see if I can find my pointer. See how it goes right here? This is where they went looking and searching for all the different land. W.B. Parker, who was a part of Marcy's party, also kept a journal during the expedition. His observations of the Indians recorded such details as dress, attitude, and habits. He wrote in greater depth about the meetings with the Comanche and Kickapoo than Marcy did. Parker recorded the Indians' reaction when Marcy told them he was in the region looking for a new home for them, and that the Great Father wanted the Indians to learn how to cultivate their land so their children would not face an uncertain future. Comanche Chief Sinaco, I hope I said that right, replied that he and Southern Comanches would do as the Great Father asked, as their former chief, Mocochope, told them to take the advice and example of the whites, as it would both make them happy and be beneficial. No evidence of white settlers was noted by Marcy, but white land ownership was one of the main deciding factors in the final locations of the reservations. Several places were considered prime sites, but much of the land in question belonged to the Texas Immigration and Land Company. When it came to designate the sites, neighbors and Marcy had to select from land that was available, not the best land in the area. This resulted in the reduction of 12 leagues to 4, a little over 18,000 acres, of which not all was arable, and it was not enough acreage to grow foodstuffs, never mind provide the adequate pasturage for stock. As white settlers moved into the area over the next few years, they purchased the rest of the available land around the reservations. This removed the possibility of the Indians gaining any more land to add to the reservation. While neighbors and Marcy had been looking, so we're going back a little bit, to try to locate reservation land, life went on as normal in the northwestern quadrant, quietly, without any troubles from the Indians. The Diary of Jos Cosby, who accompanied General Albert Sidney Johnston, paymaster to the troops in 1854, described how he had not seen any sign of homes or farms for 200 miles until he was approximately 4 miles from Fort Belknap. At the post, he spent an hour with 2 of the women, Mrs. Stein, wife of the commanding officer, and Mrs. McIntyre, wife of 2nd Lieutenant James McIntyre from the 7th Infantry, indicating that there were both free time and women at the fort. When they left Fort Belknap, they headed east into thick Indian country, but did not encounter any problems. 40 miles from Phantom Hill, Indians did steal 2 yoke of oxen from some teamsters who were camped out close to them, but other than that, there were no further troubles in the region. During this time, the first known settlers in Palo Pinto County arrived. William Allen, an early resident, stated that when he first came to Palo Pinto County, the Indians were friendly, but it changed in 1858 after a group of white settlers attacked a group of friendly Indians who were hunting on Palo Pinto Creek. This story is backed up by another pioneer, Henry Bledding, who stated there had been no trouble with the Indians before the establishment of the reservations. In September of 1854, agent neighbors reported to George W. Manypenny, Commissioner of Indian Affairs in Washington, D.C., that, quote, the Indians in our northern frontier under charge of Special Agent Hill are all friendly, and as far as I can learn, have committed no depredations. A few days later, Hill wrote to neighbors his findings that the Indians desired permanent settlement and agricultural pursuits, and that these had increased during the year. He had every reason to believe that the friendship for the white people and desire to know more about their institutions had not abated. On September the 30th, 1854, neighbors in Marcy reported their decisions to Governor Bell. They had selected 2 sites. One of these was on the Clear Fork Reserve and was located on the Clear Fork of the Brazos River, approximately 40 miles west of Fort Belknap in Throckmorton County. The second was the Brazos Reserve, located in Young County, just 12 miles south of Fort Belknap. The Clear Fork was to be the new home of the Southern Comanches, who had no desire to learn or past experience with farming techniques. The Brazos was for all the other tribes that I'm not going to say because I'll completely mess them up, who were experienced farmers and who were managed by Shapley P. Ross, a former ranger who was well acquainted with Indian life. At a council at Fort Belknap, the Ionis Hanadacos, who were represented by Jose Maria, the Caddos, the Tawaconis, and the Wichita and Wacos all met with the authorities to discuss their future life on the reservations. W.P. Parker recorded the essence of the tribe's spokesman, Jose Maria, as he summed up the position and feelings of the different tribes. And this is a pretty long quote. I know that our great Father has power to do with us as he pleases. We have been driven from our homes several times by the whites, and all we want is a permanent location where we shall be free from further molestation. We prefer being near the whites that we may be free from the depredations of the wild tribes. Heretofore we have had our enemies, the whites on one side and the Comanches on the other, and of the two evils we prefer the former, as they allow us to eat what we raise, while the Comanches take everything, and if we are to be killed, we would much rather die with food in our bellies. We would therefore prefer taking the chances on the Brazos, where we could be near the whites. Neighbors reported that not only were the bands pleased with the land selected, but the Indians would also become auxiliaries to the U.S. troops and help protect the frontier from northern bands. With the creation of the reservations, U.S. authorities, with the consent of Texan authorities, moved the Indians to the northwestern section of the state. Prior to the reservations being located in this region, very few troubles with the Indians were recorded. While only a few white settlers lived in the region before 1855, they could have been subjected to the same atrocities that settlers on the south were experiencing, but they were not. Instead, Indians and whites shared the region, traded goods, and respected each other's boundaries. While it was probably just a matter of time before white settlement would create many of the same problems that had been experienced elsewhere in the state, the establishment of the reservations escalated tensions between the two cultures in the coming years. This tension grew with such intensities that the reservations were closed down in 1859. The Indians were removed to Indian Territory. And on his way home from relocating the Indians in their new home, Agent Naples was murdered by a white rancher named Patrick Murphy. Before all this, however, the northwestern frontier experienced the relative calm of uncontested ground. Thank you.
The picture she paints is so different than what is typically, viewed. Let me ask you a question. The book, A Cry Unheard, would you comment it? Because that particular book is one of the ones that kind of helps create this image that, you step west of Fort Worth and, you're likely to get scalped by an Indian. So
I didn't find that. I don't want to argue with any authors at this point, because hopefully one day I'll be an author that somebody doesn't want to argue with. But what I have found doesn't support that at all. Yeah. It does, as more settlers come in, as the reservations are established, as a lot of the white people, namely John Robert Baylor, who is a resident of Parker County and whose brother George is proudly listed in the 1860 census as an Indian killer, as they move into the area, then the problems really start. And the Indians are actually moved to Indian Territory for their own protection. It's not just to get them out of the state. They're moved there for their own protection because there's not much else we can do for them. It was just a real sad ending. But what I have found definitely does not support the fact that there were any problems with the Indians before the establishment of the reservations in this portion. Like I said, on the southern portion and on the southern border of Texas, there were problems, but not in this portion. No. Civil War is after the establishment of the reservations, so it's a whole different mindset. It's when the Civil War starts and the federal forces are pulled off the frontier, basically the frontiersmen are out there trying to protect themselves from whatever comes in. And I'm sure a lot of things went down that weren't supposed to at that time.
In the first presentation, were you here for that? Yeah, because the comment was made that I thought was useful insight, is that in the earliest years of the Texas Rangers, when they were poorly paid, that in a sense there was almost an incentive for them to go out and create this kind of conflict with the Indians. So there was I guess the history of the Texas Rangers is one that's not, there are just some very big issues that they helped create. Much less back to Neighbors. You didn't say much about his murder, but you pointed it out. But here's a man who's trying to help work with the Indians that is murdered very clearly because of his desire to do that. So this is pretty amazing.
The real reason I got into looking at this, apart from looking at all the earlier stories, was because when I study slavery, I go year by year by year of all the slave owners in all the counties that I study. So I have 18 counties, so I'm recording. You think it's bad doing 1 year's worth of taxes. I'm doing everybody's taxes from establishment of the county to 1864. And what I'm seeing when I'm graphing them are there are specific times when people are leaving and specific times when new people are coming in. And if you start matching, and the reason this gets my attention is because I see slave owners leaving, so the growth of slavery is actually thwarted, and it's thwarted by Indian attacks that are occurring that were started by the white people to start with. So we have this whole mingling of different, it's the clash on the frontier going on. And that's how I got involved with it, looking at exactly what you just said. That's how I noticed it.
You know, the other thing is, I mean, when you're looking at this particular area and presenting this picture of, you know, relative calm, you also had the Council House fight.
Council House
You
fight.
had a lot of other major things, you know, going on in Texas. And I suspect that probably one of the things that, you know, the publicity side of what was going on is one of those things that really, you know, if the Indians were fighting or being nasty to the settlers, you know, you would generalize about throughout the whole state. So the Council House fight and the subsequent Plum Creek
the Linville
fight
raid.
and all of that. So it all applied. Plus, you know, the story of Cynthia itself, which then applied to kind of all of these, you know, things. I don't know whether it's true, but you know, in these seminars, we don't have to, you know, be totally truthful or accurate, I guess. But one of the things in one of the books that I thought was so interesting is the number of captivity stories, or books, pamphlets about captivity stories published during this period. It was enormous. One comment was there were more captivity story pamphlets published than the Bible, which is kind of amazing. I don't know whether that could be possibly true, but the publicity going on, even without CNN and without social media and all that, was pretty amazing. Yeah. And that was part of creating this whole atmosphere. Well, Debbie is also the author of the book on Will Rogers, and I don't know how many pigeons you got to know as you went up the tower.
All of them.
All of them. But she's done a wonderful book on Will Rogers, and we've got a table up here if you would like to ask other questions, buy her book. Or the other thing is, I don't know if Gordon Tonups and some of his work and his items are here on display. There is a poster that he did that is available for purchase for $25, and all the money goes back to Tommy Tonups, his widow. But it is also on that same table. So if you're interested in purchasing either one of those, please do so. But let's give another round of applause. You know,